The silence in the room was a cold, heavy thing, far colder than the frost webbing the single window pane. It clung to the thin walls of the boarding house, seeped into the threadbare blanket covering the still form on the cot, and settled deep in the bones of the two girls huddled beside it. May's hand was wrapped tightly around Lynn's, their fingers interlocked, a small, desperate anchor in an ocean of quiet. They were perfect mirrors of each other, from the dark, almond-shaped eyes filled with an identical, bottomless grief to the high collars of the tattered beige cheongsams that hung loosely on their slight frames. The fabric, once elegant, was now frayed at the cuffs and hem, a testament to a long journey that had ended here in this frozen, hostile town. Their mother's journey was over. Hers had ended on that cot, with a final, rattling breath that the wind had seemed to snatch away and carry out into the unforgiving Dakota winter. Now there was only the silence and the cold. The door creaked open, spilling a shaft of watery gray light into the gloom. The landlord, a man whose face was a permanent scowl, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He didn't look at the body. He looked at them. "Time's up," he grunted, his voice rough as burlap. "The rent was due yesterday. I can't run a charity." May flinched, but Lynn's grip on her hand tightened, a silent command to be still, to be strong. May found her voice, a whisper that cracked in the frigid air. "Please, sir, just until the ground thaws. We have nowhere—" "Not my concern," he cut her off, gesturing with a thumb toward the street. "Take your things. Be out in 5 minutes." He left the door open, a final, cruel invitation for the cold to rush in and claim the space. They had so few things. A small, cloth-wrapped bundle held their mother's needles and thread, a half-empty tin of tea, and a thin journal filled with characters that no one else in this town could read. It was the sum of their inheritance. They gently folded their mother's hands over her chest, a final act of love, and then, without a word, they walked out of the room and into the biting wind of the main street. The snow crunched under their thin slippers. Townspeople hurried past, heads down, collars up, their faces pinched against the cold and the sight of them. They were ghosts already, invisible in their sorrow. May looked at her sister, her twin, the only soul left in the world who shared her face and her heart. A tear froze on her cheek. "We lost our mama today," she whispered to the unhearing town. "We have nowhere to go." From the murky warmth of the saloon, Corcoran watched them. He saw the two identical figures emerge from the boarding house, saw the landlord shut the door behind them with a definitive thud that seemed to shake the very air. He watched them stand in the middle of the street, two fragile pillars of stillness against the swirling snow, clutching a pathetic-looking bundle. He'd seen grief before. He'd worn it himself for so long it felt like a second skin, a heavy coat he could never take off. But this was different. This was grief made stark and absolute, stripped of all comfort, abandoned in the open for the world to ignore. He took a long swallow of whiskey, the burn in his throat a familiar, dull pain. He had come to this town to be left alone, to let the silence and the emptiness of the plains scour him clean of memory. He'd built a reputation that encouraged it, a quiet man with a fast gun and eyes that promised nothing but trouble. People gave him a wide berth. It was how he wanted it. But the sight of the two girls, their backs so straight, their faces pale masks of sorrow, chipped away at the wall he had so carefully constructed. He saw the way the townspeople hurried past them, the way they averted their eyes as if poverty and loss were contagious diseases. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror. He watched as one of them, he couldn't tell which, raised a hand to wipe a tear from her sister's cheek. The gesture was so tender, so fiercely protective, it struck him like a physical blow. It was the kind of gesture that belonged to a home, to a warm room, not to a frozen street corner where hope came to die. He finished his drink, the glass hitting the wooden bar with a sharp crack of sound. The bartender looked up, startled. Corcoran didn't say a word. He pushed himself away from the bar, the scrape of his chair loud in the sudden quiet. He pulled on his coat, settled his hat low on his brow, and pushed through the saloon doors, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He was a man who ran from entanglements, a man who had forgotten the language of kindness. But he couldn't unsee them. And in this town, in this cold, not seeing was the same as burying them yourself. He walked toward them, his heavy boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh snow. Each step was a deliberate rebellion against every instinct that screamed at him to turn back, to mind his own business, to sink back into the anonymous oblivion of the saloon. The twins watched him approach, their dark eyes wary, their bodies tensing as he drew closer. They stood their ground, their shared stillness a form of defiance. He stopped a few feet away, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the whistle of the wind. He wasn't a man for pretty words or gentle reassurances. The world had stripped him of that softness long ago. He looked from one identical face to the other, seeing the faint violet shadows of exhaustion beneath their eyes, the proud set of their jaws. "You stand here much longer, the cold will take you," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to conversation. They didn't respond. They just watched him, their expressions unreadable. He had expected tears, pleading. He was met with a quiet, unnerving dignity that made him feel clumsy and crude. He tried again, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "There's a fire at my place. And a roof." He gestured vaguely with his head toward the edge of town, where a thin curl of smoke rose from a lone cabin. Still they were silent. He saw the flicker of debate in their eyes, the swift, unspoken communication that passed between them. He was a stranger, a rough-looking man with a gun on his hip. They had every reason to fear him. He sighed, a plume of white breath ghosting in the air. "Look," he said, his patience fraying, "I'm not asking. You can freeze to death with your pride, or you can follow me and see the sunrise. Your choice." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and started walking, the crunch of his boots the only sound. He didn't look back. He told himself if they didn't follow, it wasn't his problem. He'd made the offer. But a knot of tension in his shoulders only released when he heard the faint, hesitant crunch of smaller footsteps in the snow behind him. They were following. He led them to the cabin, pushed the door open, and stood aside. Inside it was sparse and masculine, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. He pointed to a stack of blankets in the corner. "There," he said. "Don't touch anything else." And with that, he turned his back on them, retreating into the fortress of his own silence. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a soft gray light. Corcoran woke to an unfamiliar quiet. The fire had been stoked, a small, neat pile of kindling set beside it. In the corner where he had left them, the blankets were folded with a precision that seemed almost reverent, and the twins were gone. For a moment, a strange, hollow feeling washed over him, something akin to disappointment. Then he heard the soft creak of the floorboards and saw them by the cabin's single window, mending the torn sleeve of one of their dresses with a needle and thread he hadn't even known they possessed. They moved with an economy of motion, their hands working in seamless harmony, a silent ballet of domesticity. He grunted, letting them know he was awake, and went about his morning ritual of making coffee. The aroma filled the small space, a familiar comfort in the awkward silence. He poured 3 cups into chipped tin mugs. He pushed one toward them on the small, rough-hewn table. May looked at the cup, then at him, her eyes questioning. Lynn simply shook her head, a barely perceptible motion. He nudged the cup closer. "Drink it," he ordered, his voice gruff. "It's too cold to be stubborn." May hesitated, then picked up the mug, her small hands wrapping around it for warmth. After a moment, Lynn did the same. They drank in silence, the steam warming their pale faces. Later that day, there was a firm knock on the door. It was Martha, the woman who ran the town laundry, her face reddened by the cold, a large steaming pot held between her mittened hands. She was a broad, no-nonsense woman with eyes that missed nothing. She pushed past Corcoran without an invitation, her gaze landing immediately on the twins. "I saw them with you," she said, her voice direct and devoid of judgment as she set the pot on the table. "Figured they could use something hot. And you look like a man who hasn't eaten a decent meal in a decade." She lifted the lid, releasing a fragrant cloud of beef and vegetable stew. She looked at May and Lynn. "You girls eat," she said, her tone softer than the one she used for Corcoran. "A body can't grieve on an empty stomach." She ladled the stew into bowls, her movements efficient and kind. For the first time since their mother's last breath, the twins were offered not pity, but care. Martha's presence was a gust of pragmatic warmth in the cold, silent cabin. While the twins ate the stew, their first real food in what felt like a lifetime, she sized up the situation with a shrewd, discerning eye. She pulled Corcoran aside, her voice low but insistent. "What's their story, Corcoran? I know their mother did sewing for half the town. A good woman, quiet, kept to herself." Corcoran shrugged, uncomfortable being the center of anyone's attention, let alone Martha's focused inquiry. Her heart gave out. "Landlord threw him out. That's all I know." Martha clicked her tongue, a sound of profound disapproval. "That's not all there is. Never is. I was saving. She told me she'd put a claim on that small plot of land past the creek, the one with the 2 willows. She was going to build a small house. Paid the filing fees to Finch herself." Corcoran's posture stiffened. Mr. Finch was the town's land agent, a man whose smile was as thin as his ethics, who wielded papers and regulations like weapons. "Finch will have his hands all over that now," Corcoran said, the words tasting sour. "He will," Martha agreed, her gaze hardening. "He'll say her debt for the filing, or some other trumped-up fee, invalidates the claim. He'll say these girls have no right to it, and then he'll come for them." She looked over at May and Lynn, who were watching them, their dark eyes wide and uncertain. "He'll see 2 young, unprotected girls with no people, no voice. To a man like Finch, that doesn't look like a tragedy. It looks like an opportunity." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The threat was no longer the abstract cruelty of winter or the indifference of the town. It now had a name and a face. The simple act of offering shelter had suddenly become something far more complicated. This cabin, his sanctuary of solitude, was now on the front line of a battle he hadn't asked for. Martha looked him straight in the eye, her expression leaving no room for evasion. "You took them in, Corcoran. That makes them your business now. Finch won't just let them be. You know he won't." He did know. He knew the predatory nature of men like Finch, who fed on the weak and the grieving. The quiet life he had sought was over. The world, with all its ugliness and obligation, had just kicked in his door. It didn't take long for Martha's prediction to come true. 2 days later, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the cabin. Corcoran opened the door to find Mr. Finch standing on his porch, a leather satchel in one hand and an oily smile on his face. He was a small man, meticulously dressed, who seemed immune to the cold. His eyes darted past Corcoran, immediately finding the twins, who had risen to their feet and stood pressed together near the hearth. "Corcoran," Finch said, his tone oozing false cordiality. "A surprise to find you playing nursemaid." He stepped inside without being invited, his gaze lingering on the girls with a proprietary air. "I've come about the unfortunate matter of their mother's estate. Or, rather," he chuckled, "the lack thereof." He opened his satchel and produced a sheaf of papers, waving them dismissively. "A great many debts, I'm afraid. The land claim is, of course, null and void. A sad business. He then turned his full attention to May and Lynn, his smile becoming sickly sweet. "But do not worry, my dears. The town has a heart. I have made arrangements for you. A fine position at a textile mill a few counties over. You'll be fed, clothed, and housed. A chance to work off your mother's debts and become productive members of society." The words indentured servitude were not spoken, but they hung in the air like poison. May's hand flew to Lynn's, their knuckles white. Corcoran moved, placing himself squarely between Finch and the twins. The cabin, which had seemed small before, now felt suffocatingly so. His voice was dangerously quiet. "They're not going anywhere." Finch's smile tightened. "This is not your concern. This is a legal matter, an official arrangement for the welfare of orphan minors." "They're not minors," Corcoran stated flatly, "and they're not orphans. They're under my protection." For a moment the pretense fell away, and Finch's eyes glinted with cold fury. He saw not a savior, but an obstacle. "Harboring vagrants is a violation of town ordinance, Corcoran. You are a man who values his privacy, his anonymity. Do not make an enemy of the law. I will be back with the sheriff." He turned on his heel and left, leaving a chill in the room that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The door closed, and the three of them were left in a silence thick with fear and defiance. The line had been drawn. After the door clicked shut behind Finch, a heavy silence descended, thick with the man's lingering threats. The fire crackled, oblivious. Lynn was trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through her body. May, however, stepped forward. Her gaze, which had so often been downcast or wary, was now fixed on Corcoran, sharp and demanding. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting through the tension. "Why are you doing this? We are nothing to you." It was the most she had ever said to him, a direct challenge that he could not ignore. He didn't answer immediately. He turned away from her intense stare and walked to the small, rough mantelpiece above the hearth. His back was to them as he picked up a small, tarnished silver frame. He ran his thumb over the glass, a gesture of absent-minded reverence. The silence stretched, and May thought perhaps he wouldn't answer at all, that he would retreat back into his gruff, impenetrable shell. But then he spoke, his voice low and ragged, directed not at them, but at the ghost in the frame. "I had a wife and a daughter," he said. "Fever took them, both in the same week." He didn't need to say more. The raw, unvarnished truth of it filled the cabin, a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He wasn't helping them out of charity. He was helping them because he knew. He knew what it was to have your world ripped out from under you, to be left standing in the wreckage with nothing but a silence where a life used to be. He understood their stillness, their quiet, fierce bond. It was the language of survivors. He finally turned back to face them, his eyes holding a deep, weary sadness that they recognized as a mirror of their own. He placed the frame back on the mantel, but he didn't hide it. It sat there, a quiet testament to the family he had lost, and the reason he was now, against all his better judgment, fighting for this new, broken one. "A man ought to do what's right," he said simply. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was an unbreakable promise. In that moment, the emotional pivot of their lives shifted. He was no longer just a protector. He was a kindred spirit. They were no longer just refugees. They were his reason to fight. Martha arrived that evening, her face set in grim lines. "I heard Finch was here," she said, skipping any pleasantries, "and that he's planning on bringing the sheriff to haul those girls away." She set a basket of bread and dried apples on the table, her movements sharp and purposeful. "We don't have much time." She pulled up a chair, turning the small cabin into a war room. "Finch is a creature of paper and ink. We can't beat him with fists or guns. We have to beat him with his own weapons." Her practical energy was a welcome antidote to the fear that had settled in the cabin. She looked at the twins. Your mother, she kept records, a journal. Do you have it? May nodded, retrieving the thin, cloth-bound book from their small bundle. She handed it to Martha. Martha couldn't read the characters, but she flipped through the pages, noting the neat columns of figures, the dates, the entries. She was meticulous, Martha murmured. This is good. This is a record of a life, of a business. It proves she was a part of this town, not some transient. She then turned her attention to Corcoran. Finch is calling a town meeting tomorrow night. He wants to do this publicly, to make an example of them and solidify his own power. He thinks no one will stand up for them. A glint of defiance sparked in her eyes. He's wrong. She tapped a finger on the table. I've been reading the town charter. It's dusty as all hell, but it's in there. Article 7. Any resident who has contributed to the economic well-being of the community for a period of no less than 1 year shall have their dependents placed under the town's protection, not its authority. Your mother was a seamstress here for nearly 2 years. She wasn't just a resident. She was an asset. The plan began to take shape. They would not hide. They would face Finch, the sheriff, and the entire town. Later that night, by the flickering firelight, May and Lynn took out their mother's sewing kit. With careful, precise stitches, they began to mend the frayed hems and torn seams of their tattered cheongsams. It was more than just a repair. It was an act of armoring themselves, of stitching their mother's strength and resilience into the very fabric of their beings for the fight to come. The town hall was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, kerosene, and nervous anticipation. Every seat was taken, and people stood 3 deep along the back wall. It was a cold night, but the heat from the crowd made the room feel close and suffocating. May and Lynn sat on a hard wooden bench at the front, with Martha on one side and Corcoran standing like a sentinel behind them. He wore his gun, a silent statement that this was not a matter to be taken lightly. Mister? Finch stood at the podium, basking in the attention. He began with a performance of sorrow, speaking of the town's duty to the less fortunate, his voice dripping with false piety. He then shifted, his tone hardening as he laid out his legal case. He produced ledgers and documents, speaking of debts and vagrancy laws, painting a picture of the twins as foreign burdens, their mother as a fiscal delinquent. These are sad, unfortunate circumstances, he concluded, his eyes sweeping the room. But the law is the law. The arrangements I have made are both legal and compassionate. It is the only responsible course of action. A murmur went through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, their faces stern and unforgiving. Others looked uneasy, their gazes shifting to the 2 silent girls at the front. When Finch finished, the mayor, a nervous man named Harris, cleared his throat. Does anyone wish to speak on this matter? Martha stood up, her presence solid and unflinching. She didn't go to the podium. She spoke from where she stood. I do. She spoke of I, not as a debtor, but as a neighbor. She told of the shirts I mended, the wedding dress she sewed, the kindness she showed. Then she held up the town charter. And I'd like to remind Mr. Finch of Article 7. She read the passage aloud, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent hall. The legal ground under Finch's feet began to crumble. Then May rose. Her legs trembled, but she stood tall. Lynn stood with her, their shoulders touching, a silent, unified front. May's voice was soft, but in the breath-held stillness of the room, it carried to every corner. My mother's hands were never still, she began. She didn't speak of laws or charters. She spoke of the calluses on her mother's fingers, of the way she hummed when she worked, of the promise she made them of a small home with a garden. Her debt is not in that book, May said, gesturing toward Finch's ledger. Her legacy is in the stitches that hold this town together. We are her legacy. We ask for nothing but the chance to honor her, on the land she paid for not just with coin, but with her life. A profound silence followed May's words. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the cold room where her mother lay. This silence was alive, charged with a collective intake of breath, with the slow, dawning shift of a community's conscience. The townspeople were no longer looking at two foreign orphans. They were looking at the daughters of I, the seamstress. They were looking at themselves in the mirror of May's quiet, powerful grief. Men who had nodded along with Finch's legal arguments now stared at the floor, their faces troubled. Women who had whispered about the burden of newcomers now met Martha's steady gaze with expressions of shame, and then of solidarity. The narrative had been ripped from Finch's control. He had tried to frame the issue in black and white ink, in columns of debt and articles of law, but May, with her simple, heartfelt words, had painted it in the vibrant, undeniable colors of human dignity. The mayor, Mr. Harris, looked flustered. He glanced at Finch, who stood sputtering, his face purpling with rage, and then at the faces in the crowd. He was a politician. He could sense the turning of the tide. He knew which way the wind was blowing. Corcoran remained at the back, a silent, unmoving figure. He hadn't said a word, but his presence had been a shield, giving the girls the space and safety to find their own voices. He watched as the moral fabric of the town rewove itself, stitch by painful stitch. Finally, a rancher at the front, a man known for his hard-headedness, stood up. "The girl's right," he said, his voice booming in the hall. "I was good people. That land is hers. It belongs to her girls." Another voice called out in agreement, then another. The murmurs of assent grew into a groundswell of support. The law had been met by morality, and morality was winning. The mayor cleared his throat, tapping his gavel weakly. The council finds that, under Article 7, the dependents of the deceased are hereby placed under the town's protection. The land claim stands. The sound of the gavel was drowned out by a wave of applause. Mr. Finch gathered his papers, his hands trembling with fury, and stormed out of the hall, defeated. The victory was quiet, but absolute. May and Lynn stood together, tears finally streaming down their faces, not of grief, but of relief. Martha put a protective arm around each of them. From the back of the room, Corcoran watched them, a faint, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. It felt, strangely, like coming home. The small plot of land by the creek was theirs. It wasn't much, just a patch of frozen earth and 2 willows skeletal against the winter sky. But it was a beginning. It was a place to put down roots. In the weeks that followed, the town's protection proved to be more than just a legal term. The rancher who had spoken up at the meeting arrived one morning with a team and helped clear the land. Other townsfolk brought lumber, nails, and old windows. Guided by Martha's relentless organization and fueled by her seemingly endless supply of hot coffee and stew, a small, sturdy cabin began to rise from the snowy ground. Corcoran was there every day, working silently alongside the other men. He taught the twins how to measure boards and drive nails straight, his instructions brief and practical. He never spoke of the past, his or theirs. He didn't need to. They were building a future, together. On the day the cabin was finished, they stood inside, the air smelling of fresh sawn pine. It was small, just 2 rooms, but it was filled with light. That evening they shared their first meal in their own home, seated at the small table Corcoran had built for them. The 3 of them ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that exists only between people who no longer need words to understand one another. After dinner, Corcoran took a piece of charcoal from the hearth. He went to the door frame, the one that would lead into their sleeping room. He looked at May, then at Lynn. "Stand here," he said, his voice gentle. One by one they stood straight and tall against the wood. With a steady hand, he made a small, dark mark just above each of their heads, writing their names beside the lines. It was the simple, sacred ritual of a father marking his children's growth, a testament to life and continuity. He stepped back and looked at the marks on the clean new wood. It was a door frame that held no ghosts, only promise. He was no longer just a gunslinger hiding from his past, and they were no longer orphans without a place to go. They were, in all the ways that truly mattered, a family.